Today's story is Winter Kingdom Part 7 by Aakash Sharma. Warm hands touched my cheeks and I opened my eyes. Something was ahead of me, sitting still in the cold, its shape illuminated by the lights of the car behind it, and its eyes shining green. "Ellen?" I heard the voice echo in my head as his hands tried desperately to wake me up. I knew it was Jim. I was familiar with the feel of him, with his voice and his warmth, and yet my gaze was held by that cat with the green eyes. I pushed Jim's hand away, and the cat turned its gaze away, and to the car, which was parked before it. It wasn't our car. I turned back, and saw with a quick motion as Jim stood up and held a gun, aiming right ahead at the car opposite us. I wanted to move away, to distance myself from this man, but where was I to go? "Stay in the car, be on your way, or I'll pump you full of holes," Jim yelled at the top of his lungs. If I was anxious before, no words could describe the way I felt now. My hands trembled, but I couldn't tell if it was from the cold anymore. The dream, or whatever that had been, was no longer on my mind. I heard a click, and the car door opened. Jim gasped, and I felt a punch to my stomach. I stood up, ready to run off, but then I saw his face, and he saw mine. He wasn't expecting it, and his face twisted in surprise. Even though half of his face was concealed in a dark beard, I knew those eyes very well. Jim shouted another threat, but I silenced him with the motion of my hand. I took one step, and the man took the next. We were a foot apart from one another, and I ran up to Dan to hold him in an embrace. The warmth of his embrace was one I was unfamiliar with now, but also one I missed dearly. Jim sat in the back next to me. He was reluctant to lose his weapon. He probably felt worse when Dan tied his wrists up using a cut-up seatbelt, yet he didn't resist. He knew that I didn't trust him anymore. He was quiet, and even though I had many questions that I wanted to ask, I held on to them for a while. My father was asleep ahead, so I spoke to Dan in a whisper. "Where are we headed?" "Your old friend Tori's place," my dad replied, in a somewhat weaker voice. "We'll talk there." Tori Reed? I was very familiar with that name. She was a friend, someone I used to walk home with from school, someone who used to be close to me until we drifted apart for whatever reason. "Why are we going to... We'll talk there," Dan said, cutting in. "You should get some rest while you still can." Dan's face had changed, and it hadn't even been so long. Maybe a year or slightly longer, but my brother seemed to have aged much more. He had grown a beard, and his skin looked rugged, rough, and so worn and tired. After we reached a rather shadier part of this neighborhood, the car stopped right next to a rather beat-up house. "No cops," Dan noted. "Crazier things are going on," my dad replied weakly, and then coughed. "I'll go check it out. If anything happens," he gestured to the car horn. I nodded, and he left the car. I watched him knock at the door, which was answered after an uncomfortably long time. And then, he entered. I didn't know how long he would be in there, but now I couldn't bear to part with him for long. I hid my anxiety within and turned to Jim, a man who was now a stranger to me. "Why, Jim?" I asked him. "Why did..." "I had to. I fell in love with you all the same. I want the truth. This is the truth. I know how it sounds, but the world isn't like what you believed it to be. There are things..." "What are you talking about?" I yelled, burying my head in my hands. "Things? Maybe demons, or maybe something else. Maybe even God, I don't know. All I know is what I was told. And I wasn't told to fall in love with you, but I did. God Told you to get close to me? No, I said I don't know. Ellen, my dad said through a wheeze, curling up within a long coat. Now that I got a better look at him, he seemed to be naked underneath. This world that we are in now, the way we grew up, it doesn't seem the same anymore. I now know that there are things, beings above us. And I know it sounds hard to understand, but he's right about that. There's something you need to know. Your mother, My mother what? I'll tell you later. No, I said, my attention now shifting to my dad. I want to know. A knock on the window startled me. It was completely lost on me that Dan was out there, and he now knocked on the window, gesturing for all of us to walk out. He then moved to Jim and placed a hand on his shoulder, ushering him up to the steps of the house. I helped my father out, and I had helped him stand up. His bare feet touched the ice as he cringed back. I felt him trembling slightly. He too seemed to age a lot, even though I had seen him not too long ago. A hand touched mine, and my head jolted up. A woman looked back at me. Her eyes were sunken in, her frame was thin and frail, and her hair was dirty. The dreams came back to me, and I remembered the old decaying thing that I had seen, but then it all died down when I realized who this was. Ellen? Tori said so softly that it was almost as if she hadn't. I didn't say a word, and instead just helped my dad into the house, as she followed behind and shut the door. I sat on the only chair in the house, while Dan had taken place on a couch, next to Jim, who still had his hands tied. There was a dusty air in the house. The windows were taped shut with layers of newspapers, and the house was so dim that it barely made a difference this night. Tori walked out and took a seat on the floor next to me. I tried to avoid looking at her, but I felt her gaze piercing into me. Hey, I finally said. You see my cat? She asked, and then turned around to look upon everyone's reaction. She wouldn't go out in the cold. I don't know why she did. She shouldn't. She'll be fine, I said, looking to Dan, who turned his head away from the interaction. Dan, what was Dad talking about in the car? What was he saying about Mom? What? Dan said, placing himself upright. I don't know. You don't know? Where even were you all this while? I asked. Tori spoke over me. She shouldn't be out that late, you know? She's not that... out of town. But that's the least important of whatever is about to happen tonight. You guys should really try to remember. Maybe you passed her? She... least important? Are you kidding me? What was Dad talking about? First, my husband stops making sense, and then you... I gritted my teeth, almost wanting to cry out of the sheer frustration of it all. But I couldn't. I was too exhausted because of the past hours. And shut up about your cat. Ellen, Dad said, walking out from one of the rooms within, wearing a white shirt under his coat, along with a pair of trousers. Tori looked up at him in approval, and Dad nodded back to her gravely. We aren't supposed to understand what's happening. That's what I think, at least. He faced Dan, and then tore out a tag from the collar of the stolen shirt and tossed it on the floor. There's something happening tonight. Something big, and I feel like maybe our whole lives have been leading up to this, and we've been nothing but puppets. And just playing our roles in whatever is going on. Pawns, Jim said, his eyes glued to the floor. Not puppets. My dad looked at Jim and Jim's side, continuing. I don't know anything except the part I have to play in all this. They were just dreams at first, but there was something surreal about them. Something more than just a simple dream. It was almost like it guided me. Jim's words stuck with me, and I began to run them over in my head over and over again. I tried my best to ignore them, but I couldn't deny that there was something surreal about them. Something more than just a simple dream. It was almost like it guided me. The horrible sight of that creature, or whatever it was that what Jim said it was? Something to guide me? There was definitely something about that witch was deeply unsettling. Something that didn't end right there with the vision. Something that extended out of it and held up its claws into the real world. Something malicious. You see, the story about the King of Winter and the Skinned Witch, it's not just a story. It's much more. My parents told me this story when I was younger. Jim, for whatever reason, had been hesitant to talk about this, and now again he seemed very uneasy. "Tell us the story. Tell us all of it," my dad said, with a serious expression. He leaned forward to listen to Jim's story, and Jim began to tell it. A very long time ago, there was a village. The people there lived simple, peaceful lives. That was until one day, a harsh winter came unannounced, and a stranger with it. I heard every moment of that story carefully. If my mother's version had been unsettling, this was disturbing. My father's face was grim throughout, and Dan seemed to be listening intently. When he was done, all of us were in a shroud of uncomfortable silence. "My parents saw the witch as a god," he said. "They began to follow a faith that was centered around her, and they never pushed me into it. And I wasn't all that interested either, but then, that was until the dreams." "There's more to this," my dad said, and then turned to Tori, whom I'd completely forgotten about. Now that I looked at her, she seemed far more uneasy than any of us. "What happened at the rehab?" "Rehab?" Tori asked. "Don't involve me in this shit. You just wanted a place to stay a while. Why were you left alive, Tori?" he asked sternly, indifferent to her answer. "What was Zachary Levitt doing?" Tori stood up, and Dan followed her motion and walked up to her. I heard the click of his gun, and gasped as he pointed it at her. Jim was surprised as well and stood up. His hands were still bound. "I saw their adopted daughter, the girl who was missing, whose own mother went into his rehab after she lost custody, skin him alive. I saw his wife in shock, bleeding for God knows how long. What happened in the rehab?" Tori and I used to be close friends, and we had drifted apart through the years as I got closer to my own family after my mother passed away. Now that I think of it, Tori had gone in with the bad crowd, with the likes of Zachary Levitt, who I came to hate more and more with my time in school. I really didn't care for her enough as time went on, but I did hear about her getting involved in drugs, though I didn't really pay it much mind until I saw it for myself on the news. They're fucking crazy," she said, terrified. I couldn't tell if it was from the gun pointed at her or from reliving what she had experienced. It's a cult. They're... like that guy said, they went on about the King of Winter and all that pagan stuff. They told me that they would help me, that they will take the pain away, but I saw what they were doing to people in there. You were scared. The 3 others with you, the 3 junkies that were killed, they agreed, didn't they? My dad said. But you didn't. You saw what happened to them and you were scared. Why didn't you just tell the police about all of it? You flagged down a car, sure, but beyond that you never asked for help? I wanted to. I did, but I couldn't trust you. He probably has someone with the police. I couldn't risk it. My dad nodded to Dan, who put the gun down. He sat back in a contemplative silence. As much as I tried not to think about it, Jim's story came back to me. His words haunted my thoughts. Winter came into this village, and people suffered for it. Their hardships increased, and they resorted to doing horrible, inhumane things, turning on each other just to survive. And then the stranger who came with the ice promised to take their pain away, to take their fears and their suffering and bear it upon himself. You see, the stranger was not of this world, and he had no understanding of mortal pain. He figured that their sins were bound within their skin, and so he took it from them, painlessly and carefully. And he made his throne out of it, crowning himself the king of winter in this village. The people didn't have their pain and their fears anymore, but they lost much more than just those. You see, it's our pain that makes us, makes us us. Our pain and our fears are what makes us do the things we do, and without it, everyone goes back to nothing. We have no purpose anymore, nothing to drive us to do anything, and no sense of who we are. That, the king understood, and so they became mindless slaves to his desires, their humanity lost. That was until a young girl, one of the skinned as they were called, had a finger intact. For some reason, that finger stayed with her for so long. It looked like it belonged to an old woman now and not someone as young as her. But that little piece of flesh gave her something the others had lost. A drive, a will to survive, a want to be free, a key to her people's freedom. "Ellen," my dad said, shaking me by the shoulder. I felt like I was in a trance. Dan had been untying Jim, and Jim had this eager, almost nervous look to him. "Ellen," my dad said again, and now I met his eyes. "We have to go." "Where?" "The station," Dan said, moving to the front of the house. "We can't leave you alone here." She can stay with," Tori started to say, but Jim cut her off. "No, we can't separate, not right now, it's too risky." We got into the car. Jim got up next to me, his hands unbound, yet Dan and my dad didn't trust him enough to hand him a weapon. My dad held a gun, one of the guns that Jim had confiscated from the skinned men. I knew for a fact that Dan had one as well. I looked out the window for a moment, and in the snow, I spotted something. That same cat stood there. The cat I saw when I was reunited with my brother. It stared at me, with those emerald green eyes, sitting as if untouched by the cold. There was something very strange about that cat. "Hey," Dan said, turning back before he started the car. "Take this." He handed me a gun. It was another one that my husband had taken from the men at our house. Dan demonstrated how to do the basics. It was a simple revolver, and I had some vague recollection of the time Dad tried to teach me to shoot. I just paid attention to everything Dan said, and just hoped that it wouldn't come to this. The moment he was done, I put the gun on the side of the car door, not wanting it in my hands yet, and turned to look back out the window. The cat was still there. It was probably the cat Tori was looking for. "There's something about that cat," I said softly. Dad didn't pay any mind. Neither did Dan, who now started the car as we began to drive away. "Cats are very sensitive creatures," Jim said. "They feel things that we don't." I looked at Jim, still uncomfortable to face him. "Another things your parents told you?" I asked. "No, it's just something that's said." "You used to be afraid of cats," I said to Dan. He didn't reply. I sat back as we drove. I didn't want a conversation now either, and so I accepted the silence. Jim's story found me again in this silence. And so the girl, with her newfound sense of individuality and a strong desire for freedom, did something for it. She went on a travel, intending to go to lands far away, resolute to return with knowledge that would save the people of her village. But she didn't get far. she met someone peculiar on the way. An old woman with 9 fingers, a witch, a being with dark powers who was on her way to seek the King of Winter. For being near him would strengthen her magic. The witch promised to help free the village, but in turn, she wanted something from the girl, a new body. Her old one was dying, and she knew that it was only through this girl's body that she could continue to live in some way. The girl, determined to save her people, agreed, and they made their way to the village. The witch began to whisper secrets. She spoke of horrifying things and lied about the fates of each villager to them. She began to cause mischief until the town of the Skinned felt pain and fear once again. She plagued their nights through their dreams, and for the day, she planted thoughts in their minds that manifested into cruel ideas. They turned on each other, more viciously than ever, and every time the king took their pain and fears away, the witch worked her tricks again and made it worse. Eventually, the king had had enough and went looking for whoever was the chaos that befell this kingdom, and he did find her. Whispering to his precious skinned slaves, whispering through dreams and through visions. And she found him too, waiting for her in a dream. And she felt fear that she had forgotten in many lifetimes that she had lived. She had forgotten that she was capable of fear at all. She only saw it in others, and if she had ever felt it, it had been so long ago that it might as well have been someone else's. He smelled her fear, and he hungered for it. But before he could take her, before he had even caught her, she had left one final message for the girl. The king shall find you, not through me, but he shall find you. He will hurt you, skin you, make false promises to you, make vicious threats, but whatever he does, you shall not give him the finger. It is something far more precious than anything your kind or any mortal can ever have. The finger, it was never the girl's. It was the witch's own. You can't let them take you or your child, Jim said, snapping me out of the trance. He held himself together, not hesitating to say what he said next. The skinned witch came to me in my dreams when I moved out of the house, and she led me to you. This finger, he said, raising his hand with the missing finger. I went so far as to take it off because I had accepted her. But I was never supposed to love you, but I didn't care, Ellen. I did fall in love with you. And that child, don't give it to her. Even if she whispers to you, and she may try. I clenched my fist. I knew that what he was telling me was sincere, but I still wanted to smack him across the face for all the lies, for the false life that he had led me to believe in. What does she look like? I asked, trying to soothe my sudden rage. I don't know. I just heard her. Ellen, my dad said, did you see something? I nodded. What did you see? Was it an older woman? I nodded again. Yes. I saw her before I passed out on the road. I don't know what it meant or what it was supposed to mean. I don't really know. Dan, you saw something similar, didn't you? Dan nodded. The night Mom died, I saw it. Is that thing that I saw the skinned witch? Dan asked Jim. I don't know, Jim said. I'm sorry, I just heard her. What about you? Dan asked Dad. I think, my dad said, and I sensed discomfort in the way he spoke. I saw his face in the mirror, and I could see the unease on his face lit by the passing street lamps. I saw the same thing, he said, dismissing it. I really hope they still have the finger back at the station. They should have frozen it in storage. We cannot let the king get it, Jim said. There's something strange about this situation, my dad said. Why would she give it to Dan? I mean, clearly Dan didn't know what was going on, and he wasn't really going to do anything with it. Why would a being like that give the finger to Dan? I laughed, out loud. earning concerned glances from everyone. I couldn't help it. It was all so absurd, too unbelievable for me. I can't. I'm sorry, I can't handle this. I felt so much anxiety from within. I couldn't tell if I was shivering from the cold anymore. There's something very off about this, my dad said again. Ellen, I saw some things in the past hours that I do not want to believe in myself, but I don't think that it matters what I believe in anymore. The rest of the journey was uneventful, questions raised and twisted like a storm in the back of my mind, but I was so overwhelmed by what I already knew. I wasn't sure if I could grasp at all the things I had learnt tonight, and I could tell that this was going to be a long, long night. I had been to the station enough to know how things usually were around there, and like everything else tonight, there was something wrong with this place too. It seemed empty, almost deserted. Okay, this might be very dangerous, Dan said. Stay in the car with Ellen. If anything happens, you know what to do, he told Jim, who nodded. And with that, he left with Dad, and they made their way into the station. As much as I was concerned about my father and brother, and uncomfortable in Jim's presence, I was still somewhat at ease to be in the car and not be alone. I hadn't planned on talking to Jim, and I made it known by facing away from him and out the window. It was probably for the best that we didn't talk anyway. I couldn't help but feel like there was something more to all of this. Something that went deeper than whatever Jim had told us and from what me, Dan, and my dad had seen. That old woman, something that was much more like a living corpse, that was somehow a piece of all of this. But as far as I could tell, no one knew exactly how the thing fit in. And there, sitting in a contemplative silence in the car, waiting, my thoughts once again began to drift to Jim's story. The king had the witch caged, starved, beaten, and tortured. Even thought the witch was a being that was beyond the living world. The body that confined her was human, mortal, and very capable of feeling pain. And even though she had endured it all through the ages, through her many lives, she was subjected to tortures that, like the king, were of another world. All that pain, all that fear, all that suffering. It eventually seemed like the witch would finally break. The king's torture seemed too harsh for even the most resilient of beings to endure. And the king smiled, roaring, for he seemed to have won. My dad got in first. We have to leave. Dan got in next, panting, and we hurriedly drove out of the place. Dan? What happened? I asked. It had been ransacked, my dad answered for him. There was no one there. There was nothing. We should leave the city, Jim said, and now as I turned to look at him, I plainly saw the look of terror on his face, that he was fighting so desperately to hide. We can't waste a single second. We need to go right now. Dan kept driving silently, but Jim was restless. Dan, listen to me. We have to get out of town, Jim yelled, and with that the car came to an abrupt stop. I felt my face bury into the seat in front of me, and I sat there stunned for a moment. I moaned. My nose hurt and I could taste the metallic taste of blood from my lips. I could smell it too now as my nose began to bleed. Everyone was silent, and I saw why. Ahead of the car, illuminated by the headlights, was someone standing there. A woman, wearing a simple jacket, standing still like a scarecrow. Her arms dangled with the wind and her body seemed slightly hunched over. Her head was covered in white bandages, which appeared to stick to her face. There were red spots all over the white cloth that concealed her head. She was skinned from within. Dan began to back the car away from her, but stopped again. There was another man, this time bare-chested. His head, like the woman, was covered in similar blood-stained bandages, but only his head. There was a triangular section of his chest, leading up to his neck and head that had been skinned as well. "Oh, fuck," Jim began to mumble. Dan was quiet, and my dad was looking out the window anxiously. Jim reached over to my side and pulled out the gun from where I had kept it. He shot at the figure standing behind the car right through the glass. My ears began to ring with the shot of the gun, and my sight began to grow dimmer. I gritted my teeth, hoping, praying for a miracle and clinging to my consciousness. I began to fumble around as gunshots came from the front as well. I couldn't tell who shot at whom any longer. I felt the door click as I accidentally opened the car door and fell out into the snow. Jim saw this, and he rushed to help, trying to pull me up. Figures with skinned faces walked up from all around us, surrounding us, and I saw them fall without a sound as bullets pierced their chests. I tried to push myself up, but I felt a stinging in my forehead as I did that. Just an instant of excruciating pain, and in that moment, I began to hear Jim shouting for me. That was probably the last thing I heard. I wasn't fading into unconsciousness. No, I was simply falling asleep, simply fading away into that beautiful agony from the bullet that had caught me between the eyes. Accepting my death, I tried to remember something, but nothing came to me. No pain, no sounds, nothing. Just the cold. And when I woke up, that's what I felt. The cold on my skin. Am I truly dead? Had it all been just a dream? No, I wasn't dead, but I wasn't sure where I was either. The room was dim, only lit by the flickering lights of the television. This place was familiar, but I couldn't quite tell where I was or what I was doing here. There was a couch placed next to the television, and on the couch, I could make out two figures. My Aunt Greta lay asleep on the couch. She looked much younger than I ever remembered seeing her. And this was her house, and she was here. She was supposed to be missing, but she was somehow here, in her own house. Somehow, much younger than she is. For a moment, I doubted if it was really even her, but that changed when I got to see that the figure sitting next to her, wide awake with his eyes glued on the screen, was my brother. He too was much younger than I had ever seen him be. I dreamt that I was much older, and that I was married, and I was going to have a child. I was so relieved that I wanted to smile. I'm Ellen Vale. I am a child. My mother is still alive, so is my father. I was never married. My aunt never went missing, and I will be looking forward to living that life that I wanted, that normal, comfortable life. My face felt stiff. I felt my cheeks, and it was cold, much colder than any living being should be. There was a window between the television and the couch, and I saw a shape in the room. A shape that I didn't quite comprehend at first sight, and had to get closer to the glass to look at. It was me, and I wasn't a young girl. I wasn't anything that I was relieved to be. Things didn't make sense if I chose to believe that I hadn't truly died and that it had been a dream all along. But to me, that was fine. I would accept that as long as I didn't have to live with the horrible reality of everything that I had lived in the past few hours, I wasn't even sure how long it had been anymore. Staring back at me was my own self, naked and with a tiny, empty hole in my forehead. A line of blood went down fresh and warm, as if it waited for me to get a look first. I opened my mouth to scream, horrified at the sight of whatever it was that I had become. But all I saw was a gaping maw, empty, devoid of light, and stretched to disturbing proportions. I was supposed to be a little girl. I was supposed to be young, younger than even my brother who sat next to my aunt. But looking at myself in that mirror, I was much older, almost the same age that my aunt was. I turned back to face my reflection, but jumped, startled by the eyes of a cat staring back at me. Its eyes shone white, with hints of red in them. Cats are very sensitive creatures. They see and feel things that we don't. I felt a man's words that I might have heard before from one of the lives I had lived. A man who had been my husband once. A man who was... I placed a hand on my bare stomach. I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel rage. I just felt cold. I heard a young boy scream and turned to find Dan staring right at me, screaming. I wanted to say something, but as I opened my mouth, blood leaked from my nose and my forehead more profusely, somehow flowing into my mouth and choking my words. I forced myself to be still and dropped on the floor, curling up. The young boy, my brother, had been screaming at the cat at the window. He hadn't even noticed my presence. The cat continued to stare down at me until I saw Aunt Greta tap lightly on the window, after which it jumped away. She then went back to my brother, who was having a meltdown, to comfort him. And then, the last life I had lived started coming back to me. The same man, the man who had been my husband once, had told me a story. A story about a witch and a king. A story with ice, winter, and skinned people. I heard his voice once again, continuing with the story. The king was convinced of his victory and went down to offer the witch his terms. He offered to take her skin away, and her pain, her fear, and her suffering. After he was done, he glanced upon the now skinned witch, who held a huge grin on her face. She had one final trick to play. So that once again was Winter Kingdom Part 7 by Aakash Sharma, the second to last part. So that means next week is the final part to this series, the absolute finale, and just the last part, the part that will wrap it all together, I hope, because there's been a lot of stuff that's gone on in the series, and while a lot of it has been wrapped up, it just keeps getting more and more mysterious and more curious, doesn't it? Aakash, you did a fantastic job, my friend. This is a really good series. I loved it. I know a lot of people liked it. Yeah, and I really hope that you all enjoyed it. And again, thank you to him for letting me narrate it. And hopefully you're looking forward to the next part next week, which again is the finale. So that'll be fun. All that said, if you did enjoy it and want more like that, please join the Nevermore. Hit that subscribe button, and if you want to be notified, hit that little bell icon. It'll tell you exactly whenever I upload the videos, not whenever you get, whatever. You can also hit personalized, I think is the other one, but, don't ever hit none, because none's the bad one. Hit all or personalized, preferably all. Anyway, you can also follow me on the social media platforms, but you don't have to. You can also support me on Patreon or Coffee, but you don't have to. All of it's appreciated and all of it's optional. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. But until then, my lovely listeners, my beautiful friends, the good people who grace me with their time, sleep well.